Derek stood in the doorway of our bedroom, arms crossed, watching me struggle to shift my weight against the pillows without using my back. I still had the rigid brace strapped from my hips to my ribs. I still had the faint yellow-purple bruise from the IV line on my left hand, and he said it the way he might read me the weather. 2 weeks from Saturday. The whole family's coming for the reunion. 12 people, 2 weeks. You know how Mom gets about the planning, so let's just get the guest room sorted this weekend. I actually laughed, thinking for half a second it was a joke, some strange attempt at gallows humor after the week we'd had. Then I looked at his face. He wasn't joking. That was the moment I understood something had shifted between us, and nobody had bothered to tell me. 6 days. That's how long it had been since the flight surgeon at Womack Army Medical Center had gone over the imaging with me in that flat, procedural voice they use when they need you to actually hear them. A compression fracture at L2, the result of a hard landing during a routine airborne refresher jump. The kind of jump I'd done maybe 200 times in 22 years without incident, until the one time my chute didn't fully deploy the way it should have, and the ground came up faster than physics owed me. Surgery. Hardware. A minimum of 6 weeks in the brace, no lifting over 10 pounds, no standing more than 20 minutes at a stretch, no stairs more than once or twice a day if I could avoid them at all. He'd printed the restrictions out for me in bold, and I still had the sheet folded in my nightstand drawer next to a bottle of oxycodone I was trying very hard not to need. "Derek," I said, keeping my voice level, because in the Army you learn early that raising your voice rarely gets you what raising your voice is supposed to get you. "I had spinal surgery 6 days ago. Can we push it back a few weeks? Even 2 weeks would help." He didn't look up from his phone. "It's already set. Everybody's got flights. My mom's been planning this since Christmas." That sentence landed somewhere I hadn't expected it to land, not in my chest, where I assumed hurt was supposed to live, but lower, in my stomach, in the place where something curdles. 22 years of marriage, and he had never spoken to me quite like that before, not with that particular coldness, like I was a soldier who'd requested emergency leave during a training exercise, and he was simply informing me that the request had been denied, the mission would proceed as scheduled, my presence required regardless of medical profile. I didn't argue. I've never been someone who argues well in the moment. I need time to turn things over, to look at them from every angle before I know what I actually think. So I nodded, and he left the room satisfied. Already texting his mother, I assumed, though I didn't ask. That night, I lay awake long after Derek's breathing had evened out beside me. The ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. My back ached in that deep structural way that reminds you your body is healing from something a surgeon had to cut through muscle to reach. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let myself actually think about the last 2 decades instead of just living through them. The way you live through a deployment, one boot in front of the other, no time to feel anything until it's over. I sent Carol a text before I let myself fall asleep. I'd learned in 22 years of marriage and 22 years of service that some conversations get worse the longer you wait to have them. Carol, I had spinal surgery 6 days ago. My doctor has me on strict bed rest for 4 weeks minimum, no visitors, no lifting, no stairs. We won't be able to host this time. I'm so sorry for the short notice, but I have to follow my doctor's orders. Love you. She called back within 10 minutes. It was almost 11 at night. Sarah, honey, I don't understand. Derek told me last week you were doing fine. He said you'd be up and around by the reunion. I closed my eyes. So that was the shape of it. Not confusion, not an honest miscommunication, but a story. Derek had already told his family before he'd told me the truth of what he was asking. I'm not fine, Carol. I have a fractured vertebra and hardware in my spine. I can't host 12 people right now. I can't host 2. Well, a long pause, the kind that carries its own verdict. This has been planned since Christmas. Frank's already told his brother. I really don't see how we cancel now. I didn't sleep much after that call. I lay in the dark and did the math I'd been avoiding for years. The way you avoid checking a bank balance you already suspect is bad. Every summer, without fail, Derek's family descended on our house like a small, cheerful army. Frank and Carol, married 49 years, who had opinions about everything from how I loaded the dishwasher to how I seasoned a roast. Frank, especially, a retired master sergeant himself who had never quite forgiven me, I think. for outranking his son in every practical sense that mattered to him. Derek's younger brother Tyler, who'd said more than once, usually after his third beer, that this house had always felt like the family house, as if that were a compliment and not a small casual erasure. Tyler's wife Jess and their two teenagers. Derek's sister Megan, her husband Chris, their toddler, admittedly adorable, but also meaning 2 weeks of cutting grapes into quarters and wiping down high chairs between physical therapy appointments. I'd have to reschedule around them. 12 people, 2 weeks, every summer, for 22 years. I thought about every deployment. Afghanistan, twice. Kuwait, once. The months Derek's family had helped out, driving Emma to soccer practice, staying over so Derek wouldn't be alone with a toddler and a full-time job. I had never asked them to stop counting that help against me. I don't think I'd ever consciously agree to the arrangement either. It had simply always worked, because I had always made it work the way water finds the lowest point and settles there without complaint. And somewhere along the way, I had started believing that every ounce of help I'd ever received while I was overseas had to be repaid in full every summer with interest in the form of my own exhaustion. Not once in 22 years had anyone asked if the timing worked for me. Not once had anyone asked if I was tired. I remembered the summer Emma turned 4 the year after my first Kandahar deployment, when I came home to find that Carol had rearranged my kitchen cabinets to be more efficient, and I'd said nothing, because saying something felt like an accusation I hadn't earned. She'd kept my daughter fed and safe for 7 months while I was 12 time zones away. Learning to read the ground beneath a Chinook by the sound its rotors made when something was wrong. What right did I have to complain about a spice rack? I told myself that so many times over the years that it stopped feeling like a question and started feeling like a rule. I thought about Frank at Emma's high school graduation, telling a table of relatives, half joking, that it was lucky Derek's family was around to actually raise that girl, seeing as her mother kept signing up to go overseas. I remembered laughing along with it at the time because that's what you do at graduation parties. I remembered how long the sentence had actually stayed with me. I thought about the promise I'd made myself in the recovery room, still groggy from anesthesia. When I told myself this surgery was going to be the thing that finally slowed me down, finally made me protect myself the way I'd spent 2 decades protecting soldiers half my age who called me ma'am and did what I told them without question. And somehow never once thought to apply that same authority to my own kitchen table. I reached for the pill bottle on the nightstand, shook one out, then set it back down without taking it. I wanted my head clear. Instead, I reached past it for my laptop. I hadn't opened the fireproof file box since my mother's funeral. There was no reason to. But that night, with Derek asleep beside me and my back throbbing in slow, deliberate waves, I carried my laptop and a small flashlight into the hallway, bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the closed lid of the toilet reading paperwork like it was a novel I couldn't put down. My father bought the house in 1985, the year I turned 5. He was Army too. 20 years, retired master sergeant, 3 combat deployments he almost never talked about except in the particular silence he'd get around the 4th of July. I grew up in that house, in the room that later became my daughter Emma's nursery, then her bedroom, then the guest room where Carol slept every summer without ever once thanking me for the fresh sheets. When my father passed 8 years ago and my mother followed 2 years after him, the house came to me, not to me, and Derek, to me. I remembered signing the paperwork at the lawyer's office. I remembered Derek sitting beside me that day, distracted, checking his phone, saying, "That's great, honey," without really looking up. He'd never asked to see the deed. He'd never needed to. In his mind, from the day we moved our furniture into my childhood home, it had simply become our house. And somewhere in that quiet grammatical shift, my ownership had dissolved into something communal. Something he apparently felt entitled to open up to 12 relatives without asking me first. I read every page twice. The language was plain, almost startling in its clarity. Sole owner. My name, and only my name, printed beneath my father's signature and the notary seal. I sat there at 1 in the morning, knees pulled up awkwardly because bending my spine still hurt, and felt something in me settle. Not anger exactly. Something steadier than anger. Clarity. Maybe, the particular, weightless clarity that comes after you've finally located the actual problem instead of just its symptoms. The next morning, after Derek left for work, I called Patricia Nguyen. Patricia and I had gone through officer candidate school together back when we were both 22 and certain we knew everything. She'd gone on to become a JL officer, Judge Advocate General's Corps, an Army lawyer, and we'd stayed close the way people do when they've watched each other cry in a barracks bathroom at 0400 and never mentioned it again. She was stationed at Fort Liberty too, same as me, and she picked up on the second ring. Bennett, you sound terrible. Are you upright right now? Because you shouldn't be. I'm lying down. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be my friend for the first 2 minutes and my lawyer for the rest of it. I told her everything. The surgery, the 12 relatives, Derek's flat refusal to even consider postponing, the text from Carol that made clear Derek had lied to his own family about my condition to avoid the confrontation of asking me directly. Patricia listened without interrupting, the way good officers and good lawyers both learn to do, letting me talk myself all the way to the point. Sarah, she said finally, whose name is on the deed. Mine, just mine. Then legally you have full authority over who occupies that property and under what conditions. Derek doesn't get a vote on a decision about your own home. You are not asking permission, you are issuing a notification. She paused. You command soldiers for a living. You've made harder calls than this one, with worse information, under worse pressure. Why does this one feel impossible? I didn't have an answer for her right away. It took me another 2 days lying in that brace before I understood it myself. It went back to the deployments. Every time I'd left, Kandahar in 2009, Kandahar again in 2012, Kuwait in 2015, Derek's parents had stepped in. Carol had stayed 2 full months the first time when Emma was 6, running the household, doing school pickups, cooking dinners I came home to hear about in loving, exhausting detail. Frank had helped Derek fix the roof one deployment, replace the transmission in my car during another. Nothing had ever been said outright. Nothing had ever been billed. But I had absorbed somewhere in my chest the unspoken accounting of it, that every hour Carol spent raising my daughter while I was 12 time zones away was a debt, and debts get repaid. And the currency Derek's family had chosen without ever discussing it with me was 2 weeks of my labor every summer indefinitely forever. I had never once stopped to ask whether the debt had already been paid 100 times over. Whether love freely given by people who loved their own grandchild and son needed repaying at all, or whether somewhere along the way care had quietly been repackaged as obligation and I'd been too tired, too grateful, too used to following orders without asking who gave them to notice the switch. That was the thing Patricia's question had actually been asking. Not why does this feel impossible? Why have you let it become a debt you're still paying off 8 years after the last deployment ended? I made 2 decisions that week, and I made them the way I'd been trained to make decisions, quietly, with a plan, and without announcing my intentions before I was ready to execute them. The first was that I would not host anyone in that house for at least the next month, not out of spite, because my surgeon had ordered it, and because I had spent 22 years putting other people's comfort ahead of medical orders that, frankly, should have outranked everyone in that family combined. The second was that I would use the time to have real repairs done, the hallway floor that had needed refinishing for years, the guest bathroom tile that Carol complained about every summer without ever once offering to help pay for new tile, the air conditioning unit that rattled every August under the strain of 12 extra bodies and never got serviced because there was never a 2-week window when the house was empty enough to do it in. I contacted the base's Wounded Warrior liaison and confirmed what Patricia had already told me, that as a reserve component officer with a service-connected surgical injury, I qualified for a short-term stay at the Fisher House on post, a facility built specifically to house military families near medical treatment during recovery, free of charge. 15 minutes from my own front door. I packed a bag before Derek got home from work. Derek's family arrived on schedule anyway. I found out because Tyler texted Derek a photo of himself standing in our driveway with his suitcases, caption "Made it," and Derek forwarded it to me with no comment at all, as though the message would simply resolve itself if he didn't acknowledge it directly. I called him that evening from the Fisher House room, my back finally, blessedly flat against a mattress that didn't require me to think about who needed the guest bed more. "They're standing outside our house right now, Derek. I don't know what you want me to do, Sarah. I can't just tell my family to turn around. I told your mother 6 days ago I couldn't host, in writing. You knew that when you let them get on the plane." There was a long silence on the line, the kind I recognized from 22 years of marriage as the sound of a man realizing too late that he had let 2 people he loved collide head-on and hadn't done anything to stop it, because stopping it would have required choosing a side he wasn't ready to choose. "I'll figure something out," he said finally, and hung up before I could ask him what that meant. That night, from the narrow bed in the Fisher house, I called Emma. She was a sophomore, 3 states away, and I hadn't wanted to worry her with any of it. But Carol had apparently already called her, looking for an ally, and Emma had heard enough secondhand to piece the rest together. "Mom, Grandma called me tonight. She was going on about how you were being difficult and making a scene out of a simple family visit." A pause. I told her she should probably ask herself why a woman who just had spine surgery wanting to actually recover counts as difficult. I laughed for the first time in a week, and it hurt my back, and I didn't care. "You said that to your grandmother?" I said it nicer than that, but yeah. "Mom, I've watched you disappear into that kitchen every summer since I was in elementary school. You'd come out for like 10 minutes to eat, and then go back to doing dishes. I always thought that was just what you did. It wasn't until I got to college and saw how other people's families actually split things up that I realized, that's not normal. That's not okay." I sat with that for a long moment, the particular ache of hearing your child articulate, cleanly and without cruelty, something it had taken you 2 decades and a broken vertebra to see yourself. "I love you," I told her. "I'm going to fix this." "I know you are," she said. "You're the one who taught me you don't leave a position just because it's uncomfortable to hold. You hold it because it's the right one." I gave the contractors 2 weeks. I paid rush rates out of a small disability settlement I'd been sitting on since the injury. Money I'd told myself I was saving for something practical, and decided this was exactly that. New floor in the hallway, retiled guest bath, a serviced silent air conditioner. And on the last day, I called Derek and told him I wanted to meet, the whole family, together at the house, before I moved back in. I don't think he expected the folder. I'd built it slowly, over those 2 weeks, mostly at night when the ache kept me from sleeping anyway. 22 years of receipts I still had scanned into old email accounts, grocery totals estimated conservatively from bank statements, a rough hourly accounting of meals cooked, loads of laundry done. Airport runs made, the kind of ledger you only think to build once you've stopped assuming it will never be needed. And alongside it, printed and highlighted my own deployment orders, 5 separate tours. The exact months Carol and Frank had stepped in to help raise my daughter while I served. I wanted them to see both columns of the ledger side by side. What they'd given. What I'd given back many times over, without either side ever once being asked to sign off on the terms. They were all seated in the living room when I walked in, Frank and Carol on the sofa, Tyler and Jess in the armchairs, Megan and Chris on the love seat. Derek standing near the window with the particular stillness of a man bracing for something he already suspects is coming. I set the folder on the coffee table and didn't sit down. Standing was easier on my back that day, and it felt, honestly, more like a briefing than a conversation. And I let it be that. "I want to be clear about something before we start," I said. "I'm not here to take anything away from anyone. I love this family. I've loved having you all in my life for 22 years. But I need you to understand something that I think has never actually been said out loud in this house, and it's overdue." I opened the folder. "This is 22 years of what hosting this family every summer has cost, not just in dollars, though the number is bigger than any of us probably want to sit with. It's the hours, the meals, the laundry, the airport runs. I want to be honest, I never resented doing it, not for a long time, because I told myself I owed it. Because every time I deployed, this family stepped up for Derek and Emma, and I decided somewhere along the way, without ever discussing it with any of you, that the debt for that kindness was mine to keep paying forever. Every August, no matter what else was happening in my life, including 6 days after spinal surgery, nobody said anything." Frank shifted on the sofa. Carol's eyes were fixed on the folder. "I want to say this clearly because I think it matters," I went on. "The help you gave me during my deployments, that was real. I'm grateful for it. I will always be grateful for it. But I have paid that debt back 100 times over, in labor, in exhaustion, in every summer I spent standing at a stove instead of sitting at the table with the people I love. And I never once got asked whether I was healthy enough, rested enough, or simply willing, before this family invited itself into my home for 2 weeks at a time, every single summer for 22 years. Silence, the kind that has weight, Tyler broke it, defensive, the way people get when a truth lands too close. Come on, Sarah, you're making this into a bigger deal than it is. Derek's never once complained about any of this. I never complained, Derek said quietly, cutting his own brother off, because every time I so much as mentioned being tired, Mom would remind me who paid for me to go back to state after I flunked out sophomore year. $9,000 I never paid back. I figured smiling to every reunion was the interest. The room went very still. Carol's face changed in a way I'd never seen it change before, not defensive, not composed, something closer to being caught out in the open with nowhere to stand. I hadn't known that about Derek, 22 years, and I hadn't known that his silence and my silence had come from the exact same place, a debt neither of us had ever actually been told the terms of, that we'd both been quietly paying off in the same currency in the same house without ever once comparing notes. I'm not asking for the money back, I said, once the room had settled again. I meant that. I kept this because somewhere along the way I stopped trusting my own sense of what was fair, and I needed to see it written down to believe myself again. I looked at Carol specifically because some part of me needed her, of all of them, to understand. I have loved having this family in my life. I have never once loved being invisible in my own house. Frank cleared his throat like he might say something. Nothing came out. Carol sat back slowly, the folder open on her lap, to a photograph. One of the old reunion pictures, everyone smiling at the camera, me half turned toward the kitchen doorway, dish towel still in my hand caught mid-motion. Always just outside the frame. She looked at it a long time. Megan spoke up next, quieter than her brothers, almost apologetic. I always just figured you liked doing it. You never seemed like you minded. I didn't let myself mind, I said. There's a difference, and it took me 22 years and a broken vertebra to learn it. I looked around the room, at each of them in turn, the way I'd once looked down a line of soldiers before a briefing, making sure every single one of them understood the order before we moved. I'm not telling you this so anyone apologizes tonight. I'm telling you because I need this family to understand that the next time I say I can't host, or I'm too tired, or I need help, that sentence needs to be enough on its own. It doesn't need a doctor's note stapled to it. It doesn't need to be litigated. It just needs to be believed. Jess, who had been quiet the whole time, finally looked up from her hands. For what it's worth, Sarah, I've thought the exact same thing about my own in-laws for years. I just never had the nerve to say it out loud. Nobody laughed. Nobody argued. For the first time in longer than I could remember, the silence in that room felt less like something I had to fill, and more like something everyone was finally sitting inside of together. House looks good, Frank finally said gruffly, not quite meeting my eyes. The floor. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close to one. But it was Frank Bennett acknowledging something out loud that he'd have once considered beneath him to notice, and I decided, for now, to let that be enough. I moved back into the house 11 days after I'd left it, walking through rooms that smelled faintly of fresh paint and varnish instead of the usual late summer chaos of a full house winding down. The hallway floor gleamed. The air conditioner hummed evenly, no more rattling under the strain of 12 extra bodies. It felt, oddly, like moving into a version of my own home that had been waiting for me the whole time, underneath the version I'd been living in for 2 decades. Derek and I didn't have some big dramatic reconciliation that first night. Real repair doesn't work that way. I've come to understand, not in one sweeping conversation, but in 100 small adjustments, made quietly, over time. What we did have, a few days later, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us, was a conversation I'd been waiting half my marriage to have. I didn't know it added up to that, he said, turning his mug slowly in his hands. Not just the money. All of it, the driving, the meals, I didn't know, because I never had to know. You always just handled it. I know, I said, and I wasn't trying to make him feel worse. I was just telling the truth, the way I'd promised myself I would from now on, even when it was uncomfortable. I'm not going to pretend those 2 weeks weren't awful, he admitted, a tired laugh escaping him. Mom complained about the hotel pillows for 4 straight days. I don't think I slept more than 5 hours a night the whole time. He looked up at me, something more honest in his face than I'd seen from him in years. But I understand now, Sarah. I actually understand. I don't think I ever really did before. We agreed, that week, on something we should have agreed on years earlier. No more standing invitation. No more assuming the house belonged to whoever wanted it, whenever they wanted it. Any future visit, from his family or mine, though mine had always been smaller, quieter, easier, would require both of our agreement in advance with clear expectations. Guests would help with groceries, guests would clean up after themselves. Nobody would treat me as staff simply because I happened to know where everything was kept. The real test came 6 weeks later, and it wasn't the kind of test either of us had planned for. Frank had a cardiac event. Not massive, the doctor said, but serious enough for a stent and a 4-day hospital stay, followed by weeks of restricted activity at home. The old current in the family started pulling immediately, the way it always had. Someone would need to manage his meals, his medications, his follow-up appointments, drive Carol back and forth to the hospital. I felt the old reflex rise in me too, the automatic assumption that I would be the one absorbing it, that my name would simply be assumed onto the list of caretakers the way it always had been. Derek got there first. He set up a rotating schedule among his siblings without asking me to take a shift. He arranged for a home health aide to check on Frank 3 mornings a week. He drove Carol to 2 of the follow-ups himself on his own lunch break and called me from the hospital parking lot afterward just to tell me how it had gone, not to ask me to do anything. Just to include me in the way you include someone you love, not the way you delegate to someone you've come to rely on. You didn't have to call and update me, I told him one of those evenings. I wasn't expecting to be looped in on all of it. I wanted you to know I've got this, he said. You don't have to run point on my family's crises anymore. That's not your job. It never should have been. I stood in the kitchen with the phone against my ear and felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for longer than I'd realized was possible. Not because he'd said the right thing, because he'd done the right thing without being asked, without being reminded, 6 weeks after the folder sat open on his mother's lap. That was the difference between a man who'd had a bad 2 weeks and a man who'd actually changed the way he moved through the world. I commanded enough soldiers in my life to know the difference between compliance and conviction. This was conviction. Autumn came the way it does with its ordinary rhythms. Emma home for a long weekend, the sound of ROTC cadets running cadence past the house on Tuesday mornings, my back finally fully healed. The brace long since packed away at the bottom of a closet I rarely opened anymore. Then, one Tuesday evening in October, my phone rang. Carol. I almost let it go to voicemail out of old habit more than anything, but I picked up, and her voice, when it came, was different than I expected. Smaller, almost tentative, nothing like the commanding tone I'd known for 2 decades. Sarah, she said. I was wondering, would next Saturday be a good time to visit, just for the afternoon? I'd call ahead, of course, and bring something for lunch if that's all right with you. I smiled, standing alone in my kitchen, the late afternoon light coming gold through the window over the sink. If that's all right with you? It wasn't an apology. Carol Bennett, I suspected, would never quite manage the actual words. But it was something I'd waited 22 years to hear. A woman who had once treated my home like a birthright, now asking, gently, humbly, if she might be allowed to knock. Saturday would be lovely, Carol, I said. I'll see you then. She came that Saturday alone, carrying a casserole dish she'd clearly made herself rather than picked up from the grocery store deli counter, something she had never once done in 22 years of visits. She set it on the counter with a kind of careful deliberateness, like someone placing an offering rather than delivering a meal. We ate lunch at the kitchen table, just the 2 of us, and she asked me unprompted how my back was really doing. Not the polite version of the question, but the real one. The kind that waits for an answer. Better, I told her. Some days I forget I ever wore the brace at all. I'm glad, she said, and then, after a pause that seemed to cost her something, I think about that folder more than I let on that day. The picture of you in the kitchen doorway. I don't think I ever really saw myself in that photograph before. I only ever saw the party. I didn't tell her it was fine. It wasn't, not entirely, and I'd promised myself I wouldn't paper over the truth, just to make a room more comfortable ever again. But I told her I appreciated her saying it, and I meant that completely. I think about that phrase sometimes, still, if that's all right with you. 4 words that cost my mother-in-law more, I suspect, than any apology ever could have. I don't tell people I forgave this family because they earned it in some tidy, complete way. I forgave them because I was tired of carrying a weight heavier than any brace I ever wore, the weight of a resentment I hadn't let myself name for 22 years. But forgiveness was never the same thing as forgetting the terms. I go back to that folder sometimes, still tucked in the same fireproof box that once held my father's deed, and I don't look at it with anger anymore. I look at it the way I look at an after-action report, a record of what happened, what it cost, and what I changed because of it, so that the next time someone tries to write themselves into my house without asking, there's already a precedent on file. I think about the woman I was 6 days after surgery, nodding because I didn't know how else to hold my ground. And I think about the woman who stood in that living room a few weeks later, not raising her voice once, and watched a family finally hear her. I spent 22 years learning to give orders that saved other people's lives and somehow forgot for just as long that I was allowed to give one to protect my own. It turns out the hardest command I ever issued wasn't overseas, wasn't under fire, wasn't in any theater with a name attached to it. It was standing in my own living room, folder in hand, saying, "This is what it cost, and I am done paying it in silence." No rank insignia for that one, no medal, just a house that finally, truly, felt like mine again. And a family that, slowly, was learning to ask before they walked through the door. If you've ever felt invisible in your own home, if you've ever given so much of yourself that the people around you forgot to ask whether you had anything left to give, I hope this story reminds you that it is never too late to be seen, and never too late to hold the line.